He called Keanu Reeves a grandpa and swore he'd knock him out in one punch. But when the arrogant UFC champion's challenge went viral, Keanu faced a choice: ignore the insult or step into the cage and risk everything. What happened next shocked the fight world and silenced millions. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The press conference was already buzzing before Blake Maddox even walked in. The media room at the MGM Grand was packed to capacity, the smell of camera lights heating the air and the low murmur of reporters filling the space. Blake, the Predator Maddox, the reigning and undefeated UFC light heavyweight champion, strode to the podium wearing his signature black leather jacket over a fitted t-shirt. His sunglasses stayed on even under the bright stage lights, as if the entire scene was just another chance for him to prove he was untouchable. Every inch of his posture screamed confidence. But it wasn't the quiet confidence earned through years of humility. It was the kind that dared anyone to challenge him, the kind that looked for a spotlight and thrived in controversy. The crowd's energy swelled the moment he sat down at the long press table alongside his coach and the UFC president. Cameras flashed in rapid bursts. Voices rose as journalists called out his name, trying to land the first question. Blake leaned back in his chair, casually sipping water, letting the moment stretch. The early questions were typical. How was training camp going? What adjustments was he making for his upcoming title defense? Would his weight cut be an issue? He answered each with curt, almost dismissive replies. Then, somewhere near the back, a reporter's voice cut through the mix with a half-joking, half-serious question that shifted the air instantly. Blake, you fought the toughest guys in the world. Would you ever consider fighting Keanu Reeves? You know. After all that John Wick training he's done? The room erupted in laughter. It was clearly meant as a throwaway question, a playful nudge in the middle of the usual fight talk. But Blake didn't laugh. He smirked, tilting his head slightly as if the idea was both ridiculous and insulting. He leaned into the microphone, his voice dripping with condescension. "I'd knock that grandpa out in one punch," he said, pausing to let the words land. "Actors are soft. I fight real men." He'd be lucky to last 10 seconds. The room froze for a fraction of a second before bursting into a mix of laughter, murmurs, and clicking cameras. Blake glanced around like a predator scanning for approval. Even some of the reporters chuckled, though a few shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The jab wasn't just dismissive, it was personal. Within minutes, the clip was uploaded online. By the time the press conference ended, it had already started to spread. Blake's smirk, the casual venom in his voice, and the phrase, "Grandpa," next to Keanu Reeves' name, made for the perfect viral storm. By nightfall, Keanu's name was trending worldwide. Some people defended him fiercely, praising his martial arts background and calling Blake's comments disrespectful. Others joined the mockery, posting memes of Keanu in action scenes with sarcastic captions. The digital battlefield was split down the middle. And somewhere, far from the noise, in a modest kitchen with the evening sun spilling across the counter, Keanu Reeves sat at a small wooden table, phone in hand. The clip played silently. His expression was calm, unreadable, but his eyes held a sharpened focus. Keanu let the video play a second time, watching every detail. The way Blake leaned forward into the microphone, the smug grin afterward, the laughter of the crowd. He didn't flinch, didn't mutter a word, but the faint tightening at the corner of his jaw said enough. He locked the phone, set it face down on the table, and took a slow sip from his coffee. It wasn't the first time someone had underestimated him, and it wouldn't be the last. For decades, Keanu had been in the public eye, praised, mocked, admired, and doubted, often in the same week. But this was different. This wasn't a tabloid headline or a misinterpreted interview. This was a direct insult, on camera, meant to humiliate. Across town, sports talk shows were replaying the clip on loop. Analysts debated whether Blake's comments were harmless trash talk or a sign of deep disrespect. The younger, fight-obsessed crowd seemed to revel in the drama, some even tagging Keanu on social media with gifs of boxing gloves and laughing emojis. But among martial artists, stunt performers, and those who had trained with him over the years, the reaction was one of quiet outrage. By midnight, Keanu's longtime stunt coordinator, Mark Shapiro, had sent him a message that simply read, "You want to shut this guy up?" Keanu hadn't replied. Not yet. Meanwhile, Blake Maddox basked in the attention. After the press conference, he did a live stream from his hotel suite, grinning at the camera as fans asked about the comment. "Look, I'm not saying Keanu isn't a cool actor," he said, pretending to soften his tone before doubling down. "But let's be real. Movies are movies. Real fights are different. I'd sleep him in under a minute." His chat exploded with laughing faces, fire emojis, and virtual applause. In the quiet of his kitchen, Keanu's thoughts drifted to his training days in judo, Brazilian jiu-jitsu, and the endless hours of weapons and striking practice for film roles. He wasn't a professional fighter, and he had no illusions about that, but he respected combat sports. He respected discipline. What Blake had done wasn't just insult him, it had disrespected the craft entirely. He glanced at the clock. Past midnight now. Anna, his longtime friend and neighbor, had texted earlier, asking if he'd seen the news. The message sat unread, glowing faintly on his phone screen. He knew that if he opened it, she'd be urging him to ignore the noise, to rise above it. But as he stood, rinsing his coffee mug, his mind was already shifting. Not toward anger, but toward a decision. Some battles weren't worth fighting, but others, some were too important to walk away from. Outside, the streets were quiet, the city's chaos muted under the blanket of night. Keanu stepped to his window, the distant hum of Los Angeles in the background. Somewhere out there, Blake Maddox was laughing, certain that his words would go unanswered. Keanu's eyes narrowed slightly. The next morning, the world seemed to have grown even louder. Headlines blared across entertainment sites. Blake Maddox calls out Keanu Reeves. Social media erupts. UFC champ says he'd KO John Wick in one punch. Talk radio buzzed with callers debating whether Keanu should respond, some suggesting he make a comedic comeback, others urging him to take the high road. Keanu sat at a small corner table in a quiet cafe, wearing his usual understated outfit. Black t-shirt, worn jeans, and a baseball cap pulled low. His phone buzzed relentlessly. Mark had called twice. His agent had called once. Even a charity he worked with had reached out, asking if he wanted to address the comment during an upcoming fundraiser. He ignored them all for now. Across the cafe, a group of young men in MMA gym hoodies were watching a replay of Blake's comments on their phones. One of them glanced over at Keanu, recognizing him, and hesitated. Then the guy smirked and said loudly to his friends, "Better keep your chin up, Wick. Maddox is coming for it." They laughed, not maliciously, but with the careless confidence of people who thought they understood the fight game. Keanu offered a faint smile and went back to his coffee. He wasn't going to win this war on social media, that much was clear. The internet had the attention span of a gnat, but this story had unusual traction. It wasn't going to die in a day. The UFC hype machine would make sure of that. If Blake wanted to use his name for publicity, Keanu wasn't going to stop him, at least not with words. That afternoon, Keanu drove to a quiet gym in East LA. It wasn't one of the glossy Hollywood training facilities where celebrities went to be photographed. This was a place for serious work, tucked between a mechanic's shop and a faded taqueria. The owner, an old boxing coach named Rafael Torres, greeted him with a nod. No questions, no small talk. Just the smell of leather gloves and the sound of fists hitting heavy bags. Keanu wrapped his hands methodically, feeling the familiar pull of cloth around his knuckles. He stepped into the ring with one of Rafael's younger fighters, moving with deliberate precision. Every strike, every slip, every pivot was measured. He wasn't trying to prove anything to the handful of people in the gym. This was about preparing himself, not for a movie, but for something real. When he left the gym hours later, sweat soaked through his shirt, the sun dipping low on the horizon, his phone buzzed again. It was a single message from Mark. "We should talk. I think there's a way to do this right." Keanu stared at the screen for a long moment, then typed a single word in reply. "Tomorrow." Back in his car, the echo of Blake Maddox's voice replayed in his mind. "I'd knock that grandpa out in one punch." The words no longer stung. They simply fueled the fire. The storm hit like a tidal wave. By sunrise, Keanu's name was trending in 12 countries. A rapid-fire montage of online chaos played out across millions of screens. Tweets flashed like gunfire. Some laughed, calling Blake Maddox a marketing genius. Others were furious at the disrespect, insisting Keanu had done more for martial arts reputation in Hollywood than anyone since Bruce Lee. Reaction videos poured in by the hundreds. Influencers paused their usual content to weigh in. A fitness YouTuber broke down why a UFC champ would destroy an actor in seconds, while showing slow-motion clips of Blake's knockouts. Another, an older martial artist, countered by analyzing Keanu's John Wick training, pausing on his clean gun transitions and crisp judo throws. Sports talk shows joined the feeding frenzy. One morning panel replayed the clip of Blake's press conference smirk on loop while a commentator said, "Let's be real. Keanu's pushing 60. His movies look great because they're choreographed. But put him in the octagon with a guy like Maddox? He's going down hard." The co-host smirked and added, "The real fight is how fast his publicist can spin this." Laughter followed, cruel in its casual dismissal. Memes flooded Instagram and TikTok. One showed Keanu's face photoshopped onto an old man with a cane, standing across from Blake in fight shorts. Another had a clip of John Wick dodging bullets, captioned, "Still can't dodge this left hook." Keanu didn't scroll for long. He didn't need to. The internet was already writing the story for him, and he was the punchline. That afternoon, while Keanu sat in his living room sipping tea, his phone rang. The name Marcus Chen lit up the screen. Marcus had been with him through every physically demanding role for the last 20 years. He'd watched Keanu bleed on set, ice his bruises between takes, and train long after the camera stopped rolling. "Are you seeing this garbage?" Marcus's voice came sharp, controlled anger threading every word. "They're acting like you're some soft Hollywood poser who's never thrown a real punch in your life. I've seen you put guys half your age on the floor in training." Keanu's lips curved into the faintest smile, though his tone stayed even. "It's just noise, Marcus. It's not just noise. This guy's using your name to boost his career. And the worst part is, people believe it. They have no idea the hours you've put in. The kali, the judo, the jiu-jitsu. You've been training for decades. You've earned respect." Keanu let the words hang in the air. Respect. It was something he never chased, but once you started losing it in the public eye, it had a way of slipping faster. "They're not talking about training," Keanu said quietly. "They're talking about the fight." And Marcus, what if he's right? The line went silent for a moment. Then Marcus's voice came back, low but steady. "He's not." Marcus's silence carried weight. He wasn't the type to hand out reassurances cheaply. "Listen," Marcus finally said, his tone measured. "You've trained with some of the best in the world. I've seen you spar with guys who compete at the highest level. You can take a hit. You can give one. But the public doesn't see that. They only see the image Hollywood builds. That's what this guy's banking on." Keanu leaned back in his chair, the tea cooling in his hands. His modest kitchen felt unusually quiet, the hum of the refrigerator filling the space between them. He had never been the type to bite when someone dangled bait in front of him. But this wasn't just a throwaway insult. It was a narrative being built in real time. A story the world was starting to believe. On the TV in the corner, muted footage rolled from a sports segment. Blake Maddox was grinning into a camera, flexing during a training session. A bold headline read, "Grandpa or Gladiator? Who wins?" The split screen showed a still image of Keanu from a recent red carpet, dressed in a suit, next to Blake in full fight gear, veins bulging in his forearms. Marcus continued, his voice firm. "They're setting you up as the underdog, Joe, and once that sticks, it's hard to shake. You've built a career on quiet strength, on skill people underestimate until they see it. Now's not the time to step back." Keanu's brow furrowed slightly. "So you think I should fight him? I think you should remember who you are. You don't need to prove yourself to the world, but if you let them write this story without you, they'll write it wrong. This guy's not challenging your skills, Keanu. He's challenging your dignity." The words landed heavier than Marcus probably intended. Keanu set the tea down and glanced out the window. Beyond the glass, the late afternoon light was fading, casting long shadows over the quiet street. He thought back to the years of training, early mornings, late nights, bruises that lasted for weeks, learning the discipline behind every strike, every throw. Not for show, not for ego, but because the art mattered. The process mattered. Now, to the public eye, all of that could be reduced to a punchline. Marcus broke the silence again. "You told me once that martial arts isn't about winning fights. It's about not running from them. Maybe it's time to show people you meant that." Keanu exhaled slowly. "Maybe." Outside, a car passed, tires crunching against the gravel. Inside, the phone call ended, but the question Marcus had reignited lingered in the still air. What if Blake Maddox was right? The thought clung to him long after he hung up, seeping into the quiet of the evening. It wasn't just about a fight. It was about what people believed he was capable of, and whether he still believed it himself. The days that followed only amplified the noise. Every time Keanu opened his phone, his feed was flooded with memes, reaction edits, and exaggerated comparisons. One clip from a late-night talk show featured a host doing an impression of an old man wobbling into a cage, pretending to collapse before the bell even rang. The audience roared with laughter. Sports podcasts dissected the hypothetical matchup with clinical detachment, listing Blake's reach advantage, knockout percentage, and grueling fight schedule. Against that, they threw up Keanu's age, the fact that he was an actor, and a series of stunt scenes as if they were proof of weakness rather than decades of dedication. A viral tweet summed it up. "One's a predator, the other's a prop." Marcus texted him clips daily, usually followed by a simple, "See what they're building?" It wasn't pressure, it was a warning. Every viral joke was cementing Blake's version of the story in the public consciousness. Keanu stayed silent in public, but inside, the question Marcus had left him with grew heavier. What if they were right? Not about him being soft, he knew the training he'd done, but about him being unwilling to step forward and defend himself. One evening, after a particularly loud sports radio segment played in the background while he cooked dinner, Keanu found himself replaying moments from his past. The grueling weeks in Japan training in judo, the long days in Los Angeles refining Brazilian jiu-jitsu with black belts who'd fought on the world stage, the countless hours of weapons drills, flow exercises, and fight choreography that blurred the line between performance and combat. It wasn't vanity that drove him. It had never been about proving to anyone that he could fight, but watching the narrative harden around him, he started to realize something important. This wasn't just about him anymore. Blake Maddox had made him a stand-in for anyone who'd ever been underestimated because of age, background, or appearance. Every joke, every meme, every dismissive comment from a commentator wasn't just hitting him, it was hitting anyone who'd been told They didn't belong in the ring, in the room, or in the fight. He rinsed his hands, turned off the stove, and sat down at the kitchen table with his phone. The muted clip of the press conference still sat in his saved videos. He played it again, watching Blake's smirk, the casual cruelty in the way he waved away the question, like Keanu wasn't even worth considering. Marcus's voice echoed in his memory. If you let them write this story without you, they'll write it wrong. Keanu leaned back, eyes narrowing just slightly. His lips didn't move, but in the stillness of that moment, a decision began to take shape. For now, he would remain silent. Let the noise grow. Let Blake think he'd won the first round. Because when Keanu Reeves decided to move, he wouldn't just answer the insult. He'd change the story entirely. The gym smelled faintly of sweat and new mats, the kind of scent that always reminded Keanu of the early days of training when nothing mattered but focus, balance, and breath. It was the annual fundraiser for the children's martial arts program he had quietly supported for years, a place where discipline and respect mattered far more than winning. Parents lined the bleachers, cheering as kids sparred in padded headgear, their movements clumsy but full of determination. Keanu stood at the edge of the mat, greeting instructors and shaking hands with families. The kids, still in their white gis, clustered around him during a break. A girl of about 9 asked if he was really John Wick in real life. A few boys laughed, trying to mimic fight moves from the movies. Then, inevitably, someone brought up the name. "Are you gonna fight Blake Maddox?" one boy blurted out, eyes wide with excitement. Keanu smiled politely, brushing it off. "I think Blake's got plenty of people to fight in the UFC," he said, trying to steer the conversation back to their training. But the question didn't die there. Later, during a break, he sat cross-legged on the mat beside a lanky teenage boy with a shaved head and a thin scar peeking from beneath his shirt collar. His name was Alex. One of the instructors mentioned quietly that Alex was recovering from cancer and had just returned to training after months in the hospital. Alex's eyes shone with admiration as he spoke. "Blake Maddox is the strongest man alive," he said. "He's my hero. He never loses. He's untouchable." Keanu nodded slowly, his gaze steady. "He's strong," he agreed. "But what makes someone truly strong isn't just the power to hit hard." Alex shrugged. "Maybe, but people respect you when you can beat anyone. That's what matters." Those words lingered in the air like a challenge. Keanu recognized it instantly, not from Alex, but from the culture surrounding kids like him. They saw dominance and speed as the ultimate proof of worth, not patience or integrity. And in that moment, the press conference felt like more than a headline. It had become a lesson. For Alex, for the kids in the gym, for anyone watching, Blake represented a version of strength stripped of humility. If Keanu walked away from this, that version would go unchallenged. When Marcus caught up to him outside later, Keanu didn't waste time. "We'll do it," he said quietly. "But not on his terms, on mine." Marcus grinned. "I'll make the call." The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot as Keanu and Marcus walked toward his old black motorcycle. The rumble of traffic was faint in the distance, but Keanu's mind was fixed on Alex's words. They were the same kind of words he had heard from kids all over the world. Admiration for raw aggression without understanding what it cost. Marcus unlocked his car, leaning against the door with his arms crossed. "You sure about this?" he asked. "Because if we move forward, it's going to turn into a circus. Maddox's people will milk this for every ounce of publicity they can." Keanu nodded. "I'm not doing it for them. And I'm not doing it to prove anything about me. This is about showing a different side of what we do." "You mean martial arts," Marcus said, reading him easily. Keanu looked toward the gym doors where the kids were spilling out with their parents. "I mean respect, balance, control. Everything Maddox isn't showing them right now." Marcus's jaw tightened. "Then we make the terms ironclad. No cheap shots, no surprise rule changes. No media traps. We set the date, the venue, and the rules, and you train like your life depends on it." A few parents waved goodbye to Keanu as they passed, some still chuckling about the idea of him facing a UFC champion. But Keanu noticed the way Alex looked back from the passenger seat of a small sedan, eyes locked on him, like he was waiting for something. That look was enough. By the time Keanu swung a leg over his motorcycle, Marcus had already started dialing his contacts. "We'll let them think you're hesitant," Marcus said into the phone. "Then, when they least expect it, we'll accept. But only after we've locked in our ground rules." Keanu kicked the engine to life. "One more thing," he added over the noise. "This isn't going to be a spectacle about knocking someone out. If I step into that cage, it's to make a point. And I'm not walking in there unless we make sure the whole world sees what that point is." Marcus gave a small smile. "Then let's make sure they do." As Keanu pulled onto the road, the wind rushed against his face, but his mind was calm. The decision had been made. He wasn't stepping into a fight for pride. He was stepping in to reclaim the meaning of the art he'd spent a lifetime studying. 2 nights later, Keanu sat in his quiet living room, the fireplace casting a faint glow across the walls. His phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was Marcus again. "They're circling," Marcus said when Keanu answered. "Maddox's manager just dropped a hint on a podcast that you're afraid to respond. It's bait, plain and simple." Keanu stared into the flames. "Let them think I'm afraid. The longer they underestimate me, the better." "You still sure you want this?" Marcus pressed. "Because when you finally say yes, there's no going back. It'll be headlines, press junkets, late-night hosts making jokes. Maddox will throw every insult he can before fight night. He's not just coming for your body, Keanu. He's coming for your image." Keanu's voice was steady. "This isn't about my image. It's about showing kids like Alex that strength without honor is nothing. That real power comes from discipline." For a moment, the only sound was the soft crackle of the fire. Then Marcus's tone shifted. "All right, we play it our way. I'll draft the contract terms. Full regulation bout, neutral venue, and no promotional control on their side. And Keanu, you need to be ready to take hits like you've never taken before." Keanu let out a slow breath. "I've taken hits before." "This was movie choreography," Marcus replied. "This is different." The call ended, and Keanu sat back, the fire's warmth touching his skin, though his mind was already far from the room. He pictured Alex's face again, the awe in his voice when he'd called Maddox the strongest man alive. That kind of belief could shape a life. This fight wouldn't just be a match, it would be a message. That humility could stand against arrogance, that respect could stand against brute force, and that age didn't define a warrior's spirit. The next morning, as sunlight spilled across his kitchen counter, Keanu typed a short text to Marcus. No grand speech, no hesitation. "Let's do it." By noon, Marcus had sent the acceptance to Maddox camp. The news spread within hours, detonating across sports media and entertainment outlets alike. Fans were stunned, critics were skeptical, and Maddox's team pounced on the announcement with smug confidence. But Keanu said nothing publicly. Not yet. He knew the time for talking would come, but when it did, it would be on his own terms. For now, the decision was made, the path was set, and the training, the real work, would begin. The ESPN studio was buzzing that morning. Producers moved quickly between cameras, makeup artists dusted the hosts' faces, and the chatter in the control room was electric. They were set to interview Blake the Predator, Maddox, live. The reigning champion whose trash talk toward Keanu Reeves had already stirred the internet into a frenzy. The hosts expected the usual routine. Blake would brag, the crowd would cheer, and the segment would go viral. But halfway through the show, one of the producers slipped a small card to the anchor with a grin. "We've just had a surprise guest join via video call," the anchor announced. "Ladies and gentlemen, Keanu Reeves." The screen behind the desk lit up, and there he was, sitting in his kitchen, sunlight spilling through the window. Keanu looked calm and collected. No studio lighting, no entourage. Just him, in a plain black t-shirt, his hair slightly tousled. Blake's smirk faltered for a moment, then returned in full force. "Well, well, the man himself. What's this? You finally gonna tell the world you're too busy filming to step in the cage?" Keanu didn't bite. His voice was steady, almost gentle. "I heard you wanted to fight me, Blake. I'm not a professional fighter, but I believe in putting words into action. So, here's my offer. Let's spar. Exhibition match. 3 rounds. And let's make it worth something. All proceeds go to children's cancer hospitals." There was a pause. The hosts glanced at each other, impressed. Blake laughed loudly, leaning back in his chair. "A charity match? You mean a retirement home warm-up? That's cute, Grandpa. But hey, if you want to step in the cage and get embarrassed for a good cause, I'm game." The studio laughed with him, but the energy had shifted. Viewers at home could sense that Keanu's words weren't part of a publicity stunt. They carried purpose. Keanu nodded slightly. 3 months from now. Madison Square Garden. We'll see if your fists are louder than your words." Before Blake could fire back, Keanu ended the call with a polite smile. The feed cut to black. The anchors filled the silence with excited speculation, the headlines already writing themselves in real time. Hollywood versus the cage, Reeves versus Maddox, Madison Square Garden, charity fight of the decade. Back in his kitchen, Keanu lowered the laptop lid and sat in silence for a long moment. The calm he'd shown on air faded, replaced by a quiet intensity. This wasn't a movie role. It would take everything he had, and then some. Within hours, the internet exploded. Clips of Keanu's calm challenge were replayed alongside Blake's mocking laughter. Sports blogs called it the most unexpected crossover in combat sports history. Entertainment outlets spun it as a David versus Goliath spectacle. Hashtags like Hollywood vs. Cage and Reeves Maddox began trending worldwide. The official UFC account even posted a photo of both men side by side with the caption, 3 months, Madison Square Garden, all for the kids. The post racked up millions of likes in less than a day, yet not everyone was impressed. On sports talk radio, commentators questioned Keanu's decision. "He's 60 years old," one analyst scoffed. "Blake's in his prime. This isn't a movie. There are no stunt doubles. Keanu could get seriously hurt." On late-night shows, comedians riffed on the matchup, mimicking Keanu's soft-spoken demeanor against Blake's raw aggression. Even some fans worried he was walking into a humiliation. But for every voice of doubt, there was another cheering him on, praising his courage, his willingness to step up for charity, and his refusal to let trash talk go unanswered. Marcus Chen, Keanu's longtime stunt coordinator, watched the media frenzy unfold with a mix of pride and worry. He had been training with Keanu for decades, had seen his discipline and precision firsthand. But the cage wasn't a movie set. There would be no retakes, no choreographed moves. This was real, and Blake Maddox was known for his merciless knockouts. The morning after the announcement, Marcus showed up at Keanu's home uninvited, duffel bags slung over his shoulder. "If you're serious about this," he said, "we start today." Keanu gave a quiet smile. "I figured you'd say that." They moved to the backyard where a heavy bag swayed from a steel frame. Marcus tossed him a pair of gloves. "We've got 90 days. No shortcuts, no distractions. You're not fighting just for yourself. You're fighting for every kid who's going to benefit from that money, and for everyone who thinks you're just an actor." Keanu wrapped his hands and slipped on the gloves. The air was cool, the sun just beginning to rise over the tree line. As Marcus called out the first combination, Keanu's movements were measured, deliberate, each strike echoing against the leather. 3 months sounded like a long time, but Keanu knew it would vanish in a blink, and every day until then, the world would be watching, waiting to see if Hollywood's quietest star could stand toe-to-toe with the Predator. Training became a second life. By day, Keanu handled his film commitments with quiet professionalism, but before dawn and after dark, he was in the gym with Marcus. Every session was grueling, sparring rounds with younger fighters, endless footwork drills, and strength conditioning that left his muscles trembling. Word of his dedication began to leak. A photo surfaced online of Keanu, sweat-soaked and mid-sprint on a track, flanked by 2 MMA coaches. Fans dissected every image, noting how leaner and sharper he looked week by week. Commentators who had mocked him at first began to say he might surprise people. Blake, meanwhile, played the media game like a showman. He appeared on podcasts boasting about how he was going to send Keanu back to Hollywood in an ambulance and teach Grandpa a lesson in the real world. His words were calculated, his grin full of teeth, designed to bait Keanu into an emotional slip-up. But Keanu never responded, not once. Instead, he spent late evenings reviewing footage of Blake's fights, studying his footwork, noting how he telegraphed certain strikes, observing the moments where his confidence made him careless. Marcus would pause the screen, pointing with a pen. "Right there. That's when you move in. You don't have to beat him at his game. You make him play yours." One night, after a particularly brutal sparring match, where Keanu had taken a clean shot to the ribs, Marcus poured water over his gloves and asked quietly, "You sure you want this?" Keanu's answer was steady. "It's not about wanting. It's about needing." That kid at the charity event, he believes strength is about crushing someone. I need to show him it's about protecting. As the days ticked away, Madison Square Garden loomed larger in his mind. It wasn't the crowd or the cameras that concerned him. It was the possibility of letting down the people who had placed their trust in him. Every bruise, every aching joint, was a reminder of what was at stake. On the final night of the training camp's first month, Marcus stood by the ropes and watched Keanu hammer the heavy bag with relentless precision. When the round timer buzzed, Marcus gave a slow nod. 3 months ago, I wouldn't have said this, but you're ready to give him more than he's expecting." Keanu simply unwrapped his hands, his expression calm. The fight might have been billed as Hollywood versus the cage, but for him, it had become something else entirely. A battle for respect, for truth, and for the meaning of strength itself. The first day of full training began before the sun even thought about rising. Keanu was on the track at 5 a.m., the air still heavy with desert chill. His breath came in white puffs as his sneakers pounded against the asphalt. Marcus kept pace beside him, stopwatch in hand, calling out times. It wasn't about speed, it was about building the engine, the kind of endurance that could carry him through 3 brutal rounds against a man half his age. After the run, they moved straight into strength training. Weighted sled pushes left his legs burning. Medicine ball slams worked his shoulders until they ached. Between sets, Marcus reminded him, "This isn't a movie fight, Keanu. You can't cut between takes. You've got to last in real time." By mid-morning, they were in the gym. A Brazilian jiu-jitsu black belt named Rafael taught him how to control the clinch against a bigger, more explosive opponent. They drilled positional escapes over and over, sweat dripping onto the mats. Every time Keanu's body wanted to quit, Rafael barked, "Again!" and Keanu dug deeper. In the afternoon, the focus shifted to boxing. A veteran trainer named Luis worked him on the pads, drilling quick jabs, feints, and short hooks designed to break Blake's rhythm. Keanu's hands swelled under the gloves, the skin raw in places, but he kept throwing. The rhythm of leather hitting leather became its own mantra. The final session of the day was judo. Marcus's idea to give him another weapon. A former Olympian named Hiroshi showed him how to use an opponent's aggression against them. When he rushes, he gives you his weight, Hiroshi said, demonstrating a throw that sent a younger sparring partner tumbling hard onto the mat. Keanu practiced until his hip joints ached, knowing every movement had to be instinctive. By the time the day ended, he was so drained he could barely lift his water bottle. Bruises had already begun to bloom on his arms and ribs. His knuckles were raw, his lower back tight. But the fatigue carried something else with it. A quiet satisfaction that he had survived the first day of what was coming. As he sat on the bench, Marcus crouched in front of him, looking him straight in the eye. "Remember this, Keanu. You're not here to knock him out. You're here to show the world you belong in that cage. You're here to earn respect. That's the real win." Keanu just nodded, his chest still heaving. Respect. That word felt heavier than any punch he had taken that day. The second week of training turned into a war of attrition. The soreness never left. It simply shifted from one muscle group to another. Keanu woke each morning with stiff joints and a dull ache in his lower back, but he never once hit the snooze button. Every day started with road work, the early miles pounding the doubt out of his mind. Marcus often ran ahead, forcing him to close the gap. "Blake's not going to wait for you," Marcus would call back over his shoulder. That simple line became the morning challenge. No excuses, no lagging. From the track, they moved into the cage for sparring rounds. Raphael brought in younger fighters with different styles, some aggressive brawlers, others patient counter-strikers. Keanu's task wasn't to dominate them, but to survive and adapt. Every time he got clipped with a hard shot, he forced himself to reset, guard up, eyes locked in. Luis kept hammering home the fundamentals in boxing. Don't chase him, make him chase you. They worked on angles, slipping punches just enough to counter without wasting energy. Luis knew Blake's style, relentless pressure and heavy hands. And every drill was tailored to disrupt that rhythm. Evenings were reserved for flexibility and recovery. Keanu sat in ice baths until his teeth chattered, then went through slow yoga flows to keep his body from tightening up. Marcus insisted on breathing drills, teaching him how to steady his heart rate under pressure. But it wasn't just the physical work that wore on him. The mental grind was constant. Every night, his phone lit up with new clips of Blake trash-talking in interviews. Blake called him Grandpa so often it had become a running joke online. Social media flooded with memes of Keanu with a walker or oxygen tank. One evening after training, Marcus caught him scrolling through the comments. "Stop feeding yourself poison," Marcus said, grabbing the phone. "Let them laugh now. In that cage, there won't be a punchline." That night, Keanu stayed late in the empty gym, shadowboxing under the dim overhead lights. Each step was deliberate, each punch sharper than the last. His reflection in the mirrored wall didn't look like a man past his prime. It looked like a man sharpening steel, strike by strike. When he finally stopped, sweat dripping down his face, he whispered to the empty room, "You won't make me a joke." The words weren't loud, but they carried the kind of weight that could shift a fight before it even began. By the third week, the rhythm of training became both a comfort and a crucible. The routine was relentless: eat, train, recover, repeat. But Keanu started to notice changes. His footwork became lighter, his combinations crisper, his breathing steadier during long sparring rounds. One morning, Marcus introduced a new drill. The cage was marked with chalk lines, dividing it into tight spaces. "Blake's going to push you against the fence," Marcus said. "We're going to make sure you know how to live there." For the next hour, Keanu fought off younger, faster partners in those cramped zones, learning to turn defense into offense with knees, elbows, and quick pivots. The jiu-jitsu sessions with Raphael grew more intense. He drilled escapes from every bad position imaginable, mounted, pinned against the cage, caught in chokes. Raphael's voice stayed calm even as he crushed Keanu under his weight. Breathe, stay patient, one move at a time. By the end of each session, Keanu's arms felt like lead, but the small victories, an escape here, a reversal there, built a quiet confidence. Louise pushed the boxing harder too. They studied tape of Blake's fights, slowing it down to catch micro movements. There, Louise pointed, freezing a frame. Every time he throws that right hand, his chin's open for a split second. Keanu committed it to memory, not as a knockout plan, but as a mental note, a reminder that even champions have cracks. In the evenings, the gym would empty, but Keanu stayed. Sometimes Marcus joined him, holding pads for extra rounds. Other nights, Keanu trained alone, the sound of his gloves on leather echoing in the stillness. He didn't think about winning by brute force anymore. He thought about lasting, about showing up with skill, control, and heart. One late night, as he unlaced his gloves, Marcus walked over and tossed him a water bottle. "You know," Marcus said, "this isn't the fight people think it is." Keanu looked at him. "What do you mean?" Marcus smiled faintly. "They're all waiting to see if Blake knocks you out. I'm waiting to see if you prove them wrong without needing to." That thought stayed with Keanu. This wasn't just about surviving the fight. It was about rewriting the idea of what strength looked like. Not the loud kind, not the kind that needed to crush someone to feel real. And so, every drop of sweat, every aching muscle, every bruise became part of a bigger picture. One he was ready to show the world. It began with a 30-second clip on Blake Maddox's Instagram. Shot in his gym, it showed Blake wearing oversized gray wigs, exaggerated crow's feet painted around his eyes, and a fake beard. He shuffled forward in slow motion, throwing lazy, looping punches toward the camera. Each swing came with an over-the-top groan, as if the effort was monumental. At the end, Blake pretended to gasp for breath, leaning on an oxygen tank someone had wheeled into the frame. His caption read, "Warming up for Hollywood's toughest grandpa." The video racked up millions of views in hours. Sports sites ran it as headline entertainment, and reaction clips popped up everywhere. Some laughed along with Blake, praising his psychological warfare. Others cringed at the blatant disrespect, but their voices were drowned out by the roar of mockery. 2 days later, Blake doubled down. This time, he filmed himself on a treadmill, barely jogging, with the speed set to 1 mile per hour. The camera panned to a digital timer labeled Keanu Fight Pace. Behind him, a teammate wore an old man's cardigan and waved a cane like a referee's flag. The betting markets shifted sharply. Before the mockery, Blake was already favored heavily. After it, the odds became almost absurd. Some bookies refused to take bets on a Keanu victory at all. Commentators framed the fight as a novelty, a publicity stunt that would end in predictable humiliation. Marcus tried to keep the worst of it away from Keanu, deleting notifications and intercepting gossip before it could reach him. But in the age of viral content, nothing stayed hidden. Gym members would share the clips among themselves during breaks, laughter echoing faintly from the locker room. One afternoon, during a break between sparring rounds, a younger fighter approached Keanu hesitantly. "Hey man, I just want you to know, I don't think it's cool what he's doing." Keanu nodded, expression calm. "I appreciate it." The young fighter hesitated, then added, "You haven't seen the videos, have you?" Keanu shook his head. "Don't need to. I know who I am. I know why I'm here." It wasn't defiance in his tone, but discipline. The kind that came from years of understanding that feeding into an opponent's noise only gave it more power. When the bell rang for the next round, Keanu rose from his stool, adjusted his gloves, and stepped back into the cage. The cameras could follow Blake's antics all they wanted. Keanu would keep his eyes locked on the work in front of him. Marcus paired Keanu with a 25-year-old lightweight who was fast, aggressive, and fearless. The kid's hands were lightning, his footwork crisp. He circled Keanu with sharp jabs, testing angles, trying to bait him into a mistake. For the first minute, Keanu absorbed the pressure, his guard high, head movement calm and deliberate. Each step was measured, each pivot deliberate. The kid smirked when a jab grazed Keanu's cheek. "Too slow, man," he muttered under his breath. Marcus watched from the cage side, arms folded. He didn't call out advice. He didn't have to. The next exchange came quick. A feint to the body, then a snapping hook aimed at Keanu's jaw. But this time, Keanu didn't block. He slipped just enough for the glove to pass harmlessly, then fired a short, precise counter straight to the kid's sternum. It wasn't full power, but it was perfectly timed. The younger fighter stumbled back, eyes wide in surprise. "That," Marcus said, "is what they don't see on social media." The sparring continued, the pace rising. Keanu's breathing was steady, his eyes locked in, his movement clean. He wasn't chasing flashy combinations or desperate knockouts. He was letting the openings come to him, showing patience that came from years of experience in controlled chaos. Every now and then, a flash of his old stunt training showed through. An instinctive turn of the shoulders, a perfectly balanced retreat into counter range. He had carried those habits into real training, refining them until they became second nature. The younger fighter's smirk was gone now. Sweat dripped down his temple, his breathing ragged. Keanu's pace hadn't slowed. If anything, he looked sharper in the later minutes, as if the longer grind suited him. When the final bell rang, both men bumped gloves. The younger fighter shook his head, half smiling. "You're not what they think you are." Keanu didn't answer. He just gave a small nod, stepped out of the cage, and grabbed his water bottle. Marcus met him halfway. "You realize," Marcus said quietly, "you just shut down a kid half your age without breaking stride." Keanu shrugged. "I'm not here to prove it to him." He took a long drink, then met Marcus's eyes. "But maybe I will prove it to Blake." The conviction in his tone wasn't loud, but it carried weight. It was the sound of someone who understood that real victories weren't won with jokes and viral clips. They were won in the moments no one saw. By the time evening rolled around, the gym had emptied out, leaving only the hum of the ventilation and the faint squeak of shoes on canvas. Keanu stayed behind, gloves still strapped, replaying the day's work in his head. The mockery videos might have been dominating the internet, but in this quiet space, they didn't matter. What mattered was what happened between the ropes. Marcus tossed him a fresh towel and leaned against the cage wall. "You could have embarrassed that kid. You didn't." Keanu wiped sweat from his face. "He's not my opponent. He's just someone trying to get better." "That's exactly why you're dangerous, man," Marcus said. "You're not chasing an ego win. You're chasing the clean one." Keanu didn't respond. He just unwrapped his hands slowly, his knuckles raw and red from hours of impact. In another part of the city, Blake Maddox was filming yet another training update for his fans, showing off explosive pad work, taunting captions like, "Too fast for Grandpa Reeves," plastered over the footage. His followers ate it up. The betting odds continued to swing harder in his favor, and the comments sections were merciless. But Marcus noticed something the public didn't. Keanu's sparring partners, after facing him, left the cage quieter than they entered, not because they'd been beaten badly, but because they'd been forced into a level of focus they hadn't expected. That night, Keanu stood in front of the heavy bag, throwing slow, deliberate punches, not for power, not for show, just for rhythm. Each strike landed with a deep thud that echoed through the empty gym. "Why keep going?" Marcus asked, though he knew the answer. Keanu's eyes stayed on the bag. "Because every time he runs his mouth, some kid out there thinks that's what strength is. If I let that go unchallenged, I'm telling them he's right." It was a simple statement, but it hung in the air like a vow. The final drill was always the same, a 3-minute round of non-stop movement, slipping, weaving, pivoting around an imaginary opponent. Keanu didn't break pace once. When the bell rang, he stayed moving for another 30 seconds, pushing just a little past the limit. Marcus watched in silence, knowing that Blake Maddox had no idea what was waiting for him in Madison Square Garden. The day had started like any other. Early morning warm-up, shadow boxing, then sparring drills. Keanu was moving well, his timing sharper than it had been in years. Marcus had set up a rotation of sparring partners to keep him adapting. In the third round, a younger fighter with a powerful Muay Thai background stepped into the cage. They traded light combinations at first, both testing the distance. Then came a misread. The younger fighter launched a heavy roundhouse body kick, aiming for the pads. Keanu turned slightly too late. The padding shifted, and the shin landed flush against his right ribs. The crack was subtle, but the pain was immediate and sharp. Keanu stepped back, raising a hand to pause the session. His breathing tightened, each inhale sending a spike through his side. Marcus rushed over, worry written all over his face. "Sit down, don't move," Marcus said, signaling for ice. Keanu waved him off. "I'm fine, just need a minute." But the pain didn't fade. Every time he tried to reset his stance, his body refused. Marcus insisted they call the doctor, and an hour later, Keanu was sitting in a small examination room, arms crossed, listening to the verdict. The doctor's tone was calm but firm. "Hairline fracture in the rib. You're looking at least 4 weeks before you can safely resume full combat training. Push it too soon, and you risk making it worse, maybe even breaking it completely." 4 weeks. The fight was less than 2 months away. That meant losing almost half the time left to prepare. Marcus leaned forward. "We'll reschedule. Blake's the kind of guy who'll take the delay as a sign of weakness, but we'll ignore the noise." Keanu shook his head slowly. "No reschedule. No pulling out. You can't fight with a broken rib," Marcus argued. "I won't fight with a broken rib," Keanu replied. "But I can train differently until it heals." The doctor warned them again, laying out the risks, but Keanu had already made up his mind. He wouldn't throw away the chance to prove something deeper than strength. He wasn't here to chase a headline win. He was here to show that discipline and purpose could outlast even pain. When they left the clinic, Marcus was still uneasy. Keanu's steps were measured, his breathing shallow, but his eyes stayed focused ahead. The next morning, the gym was quieter than usual. News of the injury had spread among the training partners, though Marcus had kept the details vague. Keanu walked in wearing a loose hoodie, moving carefully but refusing to let his posture betray weakness. They had already adapted the training plan. No heavy sparring, no explosive twisting movements. Instead, Keanu would focus on footwork drills, light pad work with limited torso rotation, and mental rehearsal. Marcus taped lines across the mat, creating a grid. "You can't hit full power right now, but you can sharpen every step you take," he said. "Footwork wins fights as much as punches." Keanu nodded and started the drills. Sliding forward, pivoting left, retreating, circling. Without the adrenaline of sparring, the exercise felt almost meditative. He visualized Blake across from him, searching for openings. Each movement was deliberate, precise, his breathing controlled to avoid strain on his ribs. When they moved to shadowboxing, Keanu kept his right side guarded, throwing crisp jabs and quick lead hooks. Sweat formed on his forehead. Despite the lower intensity, the injury hurt, but he channeled the discomfort into focus, letting it remind him of the stakes. During breaks, Marcus had him sit by the cage and watch old fight footage, not of UFC champions, but of martial artists known for strategy over brute force. They analyzed the way opponents overcommitted, the split-sec feints, the setups that turned defense into attack. "This isn't about matching his power," Marcus said. "It's about making him play your game." The rest of the day followed a steady rhythm, stretching, balance drills, and short bursts on the speed bag. Each impact sent a dull ache through his ribs, but he refused to stop. Instead, he adjusted his stance and found ways to minimize the pressure. In the evenings, He added breathing exercises, something he had learned years ago during his martial arts training for film roles. Slow, controlled inhales through the nose, long exhales through the mouth, expanding the lungs without straining the injured side. Marcus could see it. The man who walked into the gym that day wasn't just healing a rib. He was sharpening his mind. Every limitation became a challenge to solve, every drill a step toward the cage at Madison Square Garden. By the end of the week, Keanu's movements were cleaner, sharper, more efficient. He wasn't getting weaker during recovery. He was evolving. Late one night, Keanu sat alone in his living room, the lights dim except for the soft glow from the television. An old documentary played, grainy footage of Bruce Lee moving with the speed and precision of lightning. On screen, Bruce spoke about adaptability, about being like water, able to flow, crash, and change shape according to the challenge. Keanu leaned forward, the ice pack pressed against his ribs, absorbing every word, as if hearing them for the first time. The message struck deeper than before. It wasn't about overpowering an opponent with brute strength. It was about reading them, responding without hesitation, letting instinct guide every move. His rib injury, instead of being a setback, could force him into exactly that mindset. He imagined the fight in vivid detail, the blinding lights of Madison Square Garden, the roar of the crowd, Blake's imposing frame across the mat. The pain would be there, but pain could be managed. What mattered was patience. Let Blake swing wildly, let him believe age meant slowness. And then, when the moment came, respond with precision. The following morning, he returned to the gym with a quiet determination that Marcus immediately noticed. They skipped the usual warm-up and went straight into controlled drills. Keanu practiced slipping punches, using subtle head movement to let strikes pass by inches from his face. He worked on countering with sharp, efficient shots that didn't require twisting his torso too much. Every successful slip and counter was a small victory, reinforcing the idea that he didn't need to match Blake's raw power. He needed to control the pace and the distance. By the end of the second week of modified training, the swelling around his ribs had gone down. The pain remained, but it had dulled, and he had grown used to working around it. The injury no longer felt like an obstacle. It was a reminder to fight smarter. One evening, after Marcus locked up the gym, Keanu lingered alone on the mat. He closed his eyes, visualizing the crowd, the lights, the smell of the canvas. In his mind, he saw himself moving with calm precision, every step measured, every strike purposeful. When he opened his eyes, his reflection in the mirror didn't look like a man clinging to youth. It looked like a fighter who had nothing to prove, except to himself. The morning sports radio segment was supposed to be routine hype for the fight. Blake Maddox sat in the studio wearing a designer tracksuit, leaning back in his chair like he owned the place. The hosts fed him softball questions about his training camp, his game plan, and his prediction for the match. But as the conversation shifted to Keanu, Blake's grin widened in a way that made the room tense. "You know," Blake said, his voice dripping with mockery. "I read somewhere that Keanu's old man walked out on him. Guess fighting spirit doesn't run in the family. And his mom, what did she teach him? How to read poetry? That's not going to save him in the cage." One of the hosts gave a nervous chuckle, trying to steer the conversation back to safer territory. But Blake wasn't done. "I'm just saying, some guys are born to be warriors. Others are born to play dress-up and pretend. His whole life's been a Hollywood fantasy. This fight is the first time he'll face reality, and when that cage door shuts, he's going to wish his daddy was around to save him." The room went silent for a beat before the hosts fumbled to change topics. But the damage was done. By the time the interview ended, clips of Blake's comments were already spreading across social media. Within hours, sports bloggers and entertainment reporters were dissecting every word. Some fans laughed and said it was all part of the fight game. Others shook their heads, saying Blake had crossed a line. Even a few of his most loyal supporters admitted the personal attack felt cheap. In coffee shops, gyms, and online forums, the debate raged. People could argue about athletic ability all day, but mocking someone's late parents struck a different chord. It wasn't just trash talk. It was cruelty. Meanwhile, Keanu was in the middle of a grappling session with a young judo black belt when Marcus stepped in, his expression tight. "You're gonna want to see this," he said, handing over his phone. Keanu paused, still catching his breath, and watched the clip in silence. His brow furrowed slightly at the mention of his parents, but he didn't flinch. When it ended, he handed the phone back to Marcus without a word. He took a sip from his water bottle, wiped the sweat from his face, and said calmly, "Let's keep going." Marcus studied him, half expecting an outburst. But Keanu's demeanor hadn't changed. If anything, there was a new stillness about him, the kind that came from knowing exactly who you were and refusing to be shaken. The next morning, the clip had made its way to national news programs. Not the sports channels, mainstream outlets. A panel of commentators replayed Blake's words, each taking turns condemning the tone. A well-known former UFC champion said flatly, "Trash talk is one thing, but you don't talk about a man's late parents. That's a line you don't cross." Even fans who had been placing bets against Keanu began posting messages of support. On Twitter, one user wrote, "You can want Blake to win without liking this. Respect is part of the game." Another simply said, "Keanu's been through more than Blake will ever understand. Shameful." Keanu's team advised him to respond publicly, warning that silence might make him look weak. But Keanu shook his head. "If I answer him with more words, I join his game. I'm not here for that," he said quietly. That afternoon, he was spotted leaving a gym in downtown Los Angeles, dressed in plain black sweats and a baseball cap pulled low. A cluster of reporters rushed him on the sidewalk, shoving microphones toward his face. "Keanu, did you hear what Blake said about your parents?" one shouted. "Do you have a response to his comments?" another pressed. Keanu slowed his pace just enough to look at the cameras. His eyes were calm, steady. "I'll see him in the ring," he said. Nothing more. The footage ran on evening broadcasts across multiple networks. The brevity of the answer and the lack of anger behind it struck viewers as unexpected. Instead of adding fuel to the fire, Keanu's calmness seemed to strip Blake's insult of its power. Online, the moment went viral. People clipped just that line, "I'll see him in the ring," overlaying it with music, slow motion effects, and captions. Memes popped up, comparing Keanu's quiet poise to an old samurai waiting for battle. One sports writer tweeted, "Keanu just did the one thing Blake wasn't ready for. He refused to play." Another wrote, "This is what confidence without arrogance looks like." Even a few UFC fighters, some of whom had publicly backed Blake, reposted the clip with words of respect. It was clear that the public perception was shifting. The fight was no longer just Hollywood versus the cage. It was arrogance versus composure. Back in his apartment that night, Keanu sat with a cup of tea, the city lights spilling through the window. He didn't check the trending hashtags or read the praise online. For him, the words were nothing more than a marker on the road ahead. The real answer would come when the cage door closed. 3 days later, Blake tried to reclaim the momentum. He posted a new training video, shirtless, glistening with sweat, pounding a heavy bag until it swung wildly. Between combinations, he looked into the camera and sneered, "See you in the ring, old man. If you can still walk there." But the comment section wasn't what he expected. Among the predictable cheers from die-hard fans were hundreds of responses quoting Keanu's single sentence. Some users even mocked Blake for trying too hard. One comment read, "Keanu didn't have to raise his voice. That's how you know he's dangerous." Another said, "Real fighters don't need to scream into a camera." On sports talk radio, a panel debated whether Blake had overplayed his hand. One analyst noted, "The guy's been undefeated for years, but this is the first time I've seen the public start to root against him. It's not about skill anymore, it's about character." Meanwhile, Keanu continued his training without altering his schedule. The rib injury was healing well enough for him to reintroduce light sparring. Marcus monitored every movement closely, ensuring there was no setback. Between rounds, Marcus told him, "You know, the fight outside the cage is already shifting in your favor." Keanu smiled faintly, but didn't comment. In his mind, public opinion was a wave that could turn just as quickly against him if he let it distract him. His focus was on precision, not hype. One evening, after an intense grappling session, he lingered on the mat, sweat dripping from his hair. A young MMA hopeful who had been training in the same gym approached him nervously. "Mr. Reeves, I just wanted to say, what you said to Blake, that one line, that meant something to me. I've been bullied for keeping my mouth shut instead of talking trash. It reminded me that silence can be strong too." Keanu looked at the young man, seeing sincerity in his eyes. "Words matter," he said, "but sometimes not saying them matters more." The kid nodded, visibly encouraged, before jogging off to join the others. By the end of the week, sports blogs were running headlines like, "The Quiet Game, How Keanu Reeves is Winning Without Throwing a Punch." The fight was still 2 months away, but the psychological landscape had shifted. For Keanu, that shift didn't mean victory, it meant responsibility. If he was going to let his actions speak louder than words, he had to make sure those actions were undeniable. And that meant there could be no half measures when the night came. The sports world's eyes were fixed on the upcoming exhibition match. Talk shows, podcasts, and news segments buzzed with speculation. One evening, ESPN aired a special titled, "Hollywood versus the Cage," breaking down the fight. The panel featured 3 UFC legends, all former champions who had built their reputations on grit and technical mastery. Clips of Blake destroying opponents played first. Brutal knockouts, quick submissions, unrelenting pressure. His record spoke for itself, and the analysts acknowledged it. "He's a machine," said one commentator, leaning forward. "If Keanu tries to stand toe-to-toe with him in pure aggression, it's over fast." Then the footage shifted. Keanu in the gym, moving lightly on his feet despite his age. The camera caught him weaving around a heavy bag as if it were a live opponent, slipping imaginary punches, pivoting with precision. His jabs were economical, snapping out and back like a whip. No wasted motion. In slow motion, he sidestepped a sparring partner's attack with a calm, almost surgical movement before countering with a clean strike to the ribs. A retired champion named Rafael Mendez studied the clip closely before speaking. "Look at that footwork," he said. "That's not just movie choreography, that's someone who understands angles, distance, timing. He's not going to try to overpower Blake. He's going to try to outthink him." The panel murmured in agreement. Another former champion, Clay Iron Fist Holloway, added, "People underestimate the mental side of this sport. I've seen fighters with half the muscle beat monsters because they could see 3 moves ahead. Keanu might not look dangerous in a stare-down, but if he's thinking that far ahead, well, I've seen stranger upsets." Clips of Keanu's defensive drills rolled next. He caught punches on his gloves, rolled with hooks, slipped under strikes with an almost dancer-like fluidity. Every movement was tight, controlled, deliberate. The camera zoomed in on his face between rounds, calm, focused, unshaken. Social media lit up as the segment aired. Hashtags like Keanu Footwork and Tactical Reeves trended for hours. Fans who had mocked him weeks earlier now argued in his defense. "It's not always about strength," one tweet read. "Brains beat brawn all the time." Another post said, "Everyone laughed when Rocky trained too, until the bell rang." In that moment, a subtle but undeniable shift began. Mockery was giving way to curiosity. Curiosity was hardening into hope. Blake watched the coverage from his home gym, arms crossed, jaw tightening as the panel replayed Keanu's sparring sequences. Each compliment seemed to chip away at his absolute confidence. He had built his brand on being untouchable, the apex predator of the cage, and here were respected fighters suggesting that an actor could pose a real threat. His trainer, a broad-shouldered man named Vic, smirked and shook his head. "They're selling a story, Blake. It's TV drama. You know as well as I do, once you step in there, you'll crush him in under 2 minutes." Blake didn't answer right away. He picked up a medicine ball and slammed it into the floor with enough force to make the walls shudder. "I don't like that people are even entertaining this," he muttered. "He's supposed to be the warm-up act, not the main event." Meanwhile, Keanu's camp avoided any public gloating. Marcus Chen, his stunt coordinator and now de facto head coach, reminded the team daily, "We're not here to win Twitter debates, we're here to win respect." That mantra seeped into every training session, every quiet moment in the gym. Reporters began showing up outside Keanu's training facility, hoping to catch a glimpse of his progress. When asked about the sudden wave of positive press, Keanu gave a modest shrug. "People will think what they think. My job is to be ready when the bell rings." His measured words contrasted sharply with Blake's aggressive media presence, creating a narrative of calm discipline versus raw dominance. The shift wasn't just in the media. Even betting odds reflected the changing mood. Bookmakers still had Blake as the heavy favorite, but the gap was narrowing slightly, enough to be noticed. Sports radio callers debated endlessly about whether Keanu's experience with decades of choreographed fights might translate into real ring strategy. Some scoffed, others insisted it could. On a late-night sports recap show, Rafael Mendez returned to the point he had made earlier. The guy's been training with real martial artists for over 20 years. He's not a stranger to the grind. And more importantly, he's not fighting for fame. You can't underestimate a man who's fighting for something bigger than himself. Those words hit home with viewers. In the comment sections, fans began asking the same question. What exactly is Keanu fighting for? That unanswered question fueled the growing intrigue. Blake took the media's growing curiosity as a personal insult. In his next press appearance, he leaned forward in his chair, eyes narrowing at the camera. "You want to know what I think about Keanu Reeves?" he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "I think he's a pretender, who's about to get exposed in front of the whole world. And when I'm done, nobody will ever talk about this match again." The statement drew gasps from the panel host and even some awkward silence. But it was clear Blake intended to double down on the image of himself as the immovable wall. His followers cheered him on, but among neutral fans, the bravado felt less like confidence and more like desperation. Back in his quiet training space, Keanu heard about the remarks, but didn't react outwardly. Instead, he focused on perfecting a defensive maneuver Marcus had been drilling into him for weeks. Every slip, every pivot, every subtle shift of weight became second nature. He knew that on fight night, it would take only one well-timed counter to change the momentum entirely. The UFC legends continued their analysis in follow-up segments. One former heavyweight champion, known for his brutal knockouts, surprised everyone with his take. "I'm telling you, people think this is all for show, but Keanu's fighting like a man with nothing to lose and something to prove. That's dangerous, very dangerous." Clips of that comment spread across social media, stitched alongside slow-motion footage of Keanu's sharp counters and calculated footwork. The narrative was shifting before the audience's eyes. The Hollywood underdog was no longer just a novelty act. He was becoming a legitimate contender in the public's imagination. Blake's camp noticed the change and adjusted their own media strategy. They released intense training clips, explosive pad work, brutal cage drills, raw displays of power. But instead of intimidating everyone, the contrast only highlighted the philosophical gap between the two men. Blake's strength was obvious. Keanu's resilience was quietly growing. By the end of the week, a new poll shocked even the promoters. When asked who they wanted to see win, the majority now leaned toward Keanu. The result wasn't about odds or stats, it was about narrative. Fans wanted to see if the quiet fighter could topple the loud champion. Blake saw the numbers and clenched his fists. "Fine," he said to Vic, eyes blazing. "If they want a show, I'll give them one, but when I'm done, he won't get up." The battle lines were drawn. The world was watching. The day before the fight, Madison Square Garden was electric. The press conference had drawn an audience far larger than anyone expected. Reporters filled every seat, camera crews lined the walls, and fans stood pressed against barricades outside, chanting both men's names. This wasn't just a fight anymore. It was an event with the weight of a cultural moment. Keanu arrived quietly, wearing a simple black suit and no entourage. Marcus walked beside him, steady and watchful, while security guided them through the narrow back hallways toward the stage. He could already hear the crowd's roar vibrating through the floor. On the opposite side, Blake made his entrance like a showman. He wore a designer tracksuit, mirrored sunglasses, and a grin that seemed calculated to provoke. His team trailed behind, carrying gym bags and water bottles like a conquering army preparing for victory. The two men took their seats at opposite ends of the long table, with the event moderator in the center. Microphones were adjusted, cameras focused in, and the questions began. Blake wasted no time. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, and smirked in Keanu's direction. "Tomorrow," he said loudly enough for every mic to catch, "we're going to see if Hollywood scripts can save you from reality." The crowd reacted instantly, a mix of laughter and boos. Keanu didn't move. His gaze stayed fixed on the moderator, waiting for the next question. The restraint only seemed to fuel Blake's irritation. The press conference continued for nearly 30 minutes. Blake filled his answers with jabs and provocations, talking about Keanu's age, his slow movie punches, and how he planned to end this in the first round. Keanu kept his responses short, focusing on the charity cause and the opportunity to inspire young fighters. The contrast between them was striking. One man desperate to dominate the stage, the other content to let his presence speak. Then came the stare down. The two men stepped forward to the center of the stage. Flashbulbs erupted as they stood inches apart, locking eyes. Blake's smile widened. Without warning, he shoved Keanu hard in the chest. The crowd gasped. Keanu didn't flinch. His feet stayed planted, his eyes never breaking contact. His voice was calm, almost quiet, but the microphones caught every syllable. "Tomorrow," he said evenly, "we'll see." For a moment, the room went utterly silent. Even Blake's confident grin faltered, just slightly. Something in Keanu's steady tone had cut through the noise. The silence after Keanu's words lingered for an uncomfortable beat. The cameras kept flashing, desperate to catch every micro-expression between them. Blake straightened, his grin tightening into something more forced. He muttered something under his breath, but the crowd was still too stunned to react. The moderator quickly stepped in, announcing the official end of the face-off, but the tension was thick enough to taste. Security moved between the two men, guiding them back to their respective sides of the stage. Blake turned to the crowd and raised his fists, playing to his supporters, but the moment didn't land with the same energy as before. Keanu stepped back to his chair without a word. He sat, hands folded loosely in his lap, while the last few questions wrapped up. Marcus leaned over and whispered, "You just rattled him." Keanu gave a small shake of the head, as if dismissing the thought. But the truth was clear. Something had shifted. As the press conference concluded, the two fighters exited through separate tunnels. Blake's sigh erupted into loud, brash conversation, voices carrying down the hall. Keanu's side was quieter. Marcus walked beside him, and the rest of the small team followed a few steps behind. Outside the arena, reporters swarmed, thrusting microphones and cameras toward both fighters. Blake gave sound bites full of bravado, predicting an easy win and dismissing Keanu's composure as a front for fear. Keanu, on the other hand, kept his words simple. "We're here to raise money for children's cancer hospitals. That's the focus." Then he walked away. That night, sports networks replayed the shove and Keanu's unshaken reaction on a loop. Analysts debated whether his calm was a sign of unbreakable mental strength or quiet desperation. Some claimed Blake had won the psychological battle. Others argued that Keanu's stillness was more dangerous than any display of aggression. On social media, the clip went viral. Fans slowed it down, pointing out how Keanu's feet never moved an inch despite the force of Blake's push. Memes flooded the internet, some mocking, others admiring. One particularly popular post read, "Gravity didn't move him, neither will Blake." Meanwhile, in a quiet hotel room overlooking the city skyline, Keanu sat alone at the edge of his bed. He had turned off the television and muted his phone. The noise outside didn't matter. Tomorrow would not be about shoves, insults, or camera flashes. It would be about showing the world, and himself, what discipline looked like when it was tested. Keanu rose from the bed and walked to the window, hands resting lightly on the curtain. The city glowed beneath him, a restless ocean of lights and movement. Somewhere out there, Blake was probably laughing with friends, watching his own highlight reels, feeding the fire of his confidence. But Keanu's thoughts were elsewhere. He pictured the faces of the children from the charity event weeks ago, their eyes bright, their laughter sharp with innocence. He remembered the boy who had called Blake the strongest man alive, and how that phrase had stuck in his chest like a stone. Tomorrow, strength would be defined differently. Not in punches landed, but in what you stood for while the world watched. He turned away from the glass and opened the small duffel bag on the desk. Inside, neatly folded, was the same worn gi he had trained in for years. It smelled faintly of sweat and laundry soap, an anchor to every hour of discipline that had brought him here. He didn't know if he would wear it in the ring. That wasn't the point. It was a reminder. Marcus knocked once before entering. He set down 2 bottles of water and a protein bar. "You should try to sleep," he said. Keanu nodded, though he knew sleep would be shallow at best. "Tomorrow's going to be loud," Marcus added, half smiling. "But we'll make sure they hear the right thing." The hours slipped by. Midnight came and went. Keanu lay in bed, his breathing steady, his mind rehearsing each movement. Not as a fighter desperate to win, but as a man determined to walk out of that ring knowing he had stayed true to himself. In another part of the city, the press machine churned on. Betting lines were still stacked heavily in Blake's favor, but online polls showed a noticeable swing. People who had once dismissed Keanu as an easy target were now quietly rooting for him. Something about the calm at the press conference had resonated. An unspoken challenge to the idea that only noise could command attention. By dawn, the first news cycle of the day replayed the shove again, this time alongside side-by-side interviews. Blake's voice was loud, sharp, almost manic in its confidence. Keanu's was measured, deliberate, unhurried. The contrast was striking, and for the first time since the match had been announced, Blake's victory no longer felt inevitable to the world watching. Tomorrow, the truth would be decided. The streets around Madison Square Garden were alive hours before the first punch would be thrown. Spotlights swept across the skyline, flashing over banners that showed Blake's chiseled glare on one side and Keanu's calm, unreadable face on the other. The city's hume had turned into a concentrated roar, a mixture of fight fans, Hollywood followers, and people drawn simply by the weight of the spectacle. Inside, the arena was a cathedral of anticipation. Every seat was filled. Actors sat beside athletes, directors beside UFC champions. The cameras caught faces that would headline their own films and fights, but tonight they were part of the audience, united by curiosity about whether the movie star could stand his ground against a cage fighter. The air smelled faintly of popcorn, leather, and adrenaline. When the lights dimmed, the crowd's noise swelled, knowing what was about to happen. The announcer's voice boomed through the sound system, his tone dripping with showmanship as he built the tension. First, the screens lit up with a high-energy montage of Blake's past knockouts, each clip timed perfectly with the opening chords of a heavy metal anthem. Flames shot up along the runway as Blake appeared, shirtless under a sleeveless hoodie, his fists wrapped tight, his jaw locked in a smirk. He stalked toward the ring with the arrogance of a man convinced this night belonged to him. He threw shadow punches in the air, each movement exaggerated for the cameras. Fans leaned over the barricades to slap his gloves. He didn't break stride, his eyes locked on the cage ahead. Pyrotechnics erupted behind him, painting his entrance in smoke and fire. As Blake stepped into the ring, he raised both arms to the crowd, soaking in the adoration and the scattered boos alike. He mouthed something toward Keanu's side of the arena, though the cameras didn't catch the words. His team huddled in his corner, checking his gloves, giving last-minute advice he barely seemed to hear. Then the lights dimmed again, the noise shifted. Not louder, but different, deeper. The first beat of the taiko drum rolled through the arena, low and resonant, like a heartbeat magnified. The spotlight narrowed to the entrance tunnel. Out of the shadows stepped Keanu, wearing a plain black gi top over his fight shorts, the fabric loose and unadorned. His hands were wrapped in crisp white tape, but there was no flexing, no theatrics. The drumbeat continued, slow and deliberate, each strike echoing in the chest of everyone present. He moved forward with the measured pace of someone walking into a temple, not an arena. The crowd, so loud a moment ago, quieted in waves. Some fans rose to their feet without realizing it, drawn into the gravity of the moment. The drumbeat quickened slightly, joined by a hunting flute, and the sound seemed to erase the noise of the world outside. Keanu didn't look left or right. His gaze stayed fixed on the ring ahead. There was no glare, no false bravado, only focus. He passed row after row of faces. Children leaning over the barrier, veterans in decorated caps, fellow actors offering small nods of encouragement. Near the halfway point, he reached out briefly to clasp the hand of a boy in a wheelchair, the same young cancer survivor from the charity event. The boy's eyes were wide, and though the cameras didn't catch their words, the brief exchange was enough to draw an audible reaction from the crowd. Keanu continued walking, the drumbeat steady, the rhythm syncing with his steps. When he reached the cage, he paused just outside the open door. He bowed slightly, not to the crowd, but to the space itself. It was a small gesture, but it carried weight, an acknowledgement that this was more than a fight. Then he stepped inside, his bare feet brushing the mat. Across from him, Blake smirked and shook his head, mouthing something clearly meant to provoke. Keanu didn't react. He simply moved to his corner, his team surrounding him for final checks. A sip of water, the tightening of his gloves, the coach's quiet words in his ear. The drums faded, replaced by the hum of the crowd building again, as if everyone collectively took a breath before the storm. The referee brought both fighters to the center for instructions. The contrast between them was impossible to miss. Blake stood with his shoulders rolled forward, jaw tight, eyes darting for any sign of intimidation. Keanu stood loose, posture straight, breathing slow. When the referee asked them to touch gloves, Blake smacked his forward with a sharp snap, trying to make a statement. Keanu's grip was firm but controlled, his eyes holding steady on Blake's for just long enough to convey that he was unshaken. They returned to their corners. Blake's team patted him down, one last round of chest slaps and shouts. Across the way, Keanu closed his eyes for a moment, shutting out the noise. In that silence, he recalled the faces of the children from the charity event, the lessons from Marcus, the long nights training alone with aching ribs. Every image blended into a single purpose. The announcer's voice boomed through the arena, introducing Blake first. The crowd erupted in cheers and jeers, the volume hitting a fever pitch. Then came Keanu's name. It started with pockets of applause, but quickly grew into a rolling wave of support that even surprised some in attendance. The sound wasn't the roar of a partisan crowd. It was deeper, more respectful, almost protective. The referee checked them both once more, then stepped back. The bell rang. The first sound after the bell wasn't a punch or a kick. It was the surge of the audience rising in unison, sensing the weight of the moment. Blake came forward with quick footwork, testing distance. Keanu didn't move to meet him right away. He circled, measuring, forcing Blake to adjust. The rhythm of the fight hadn't yet taken shape, but the energy in the building was electric. Every feint, every shift of stance drew a murmur. Those who had doubted Keanu now leaned forward in their seats. Those who had believed all along sat with quiet pride, waiting to see the first exchange. As the seconds ticked away in that opening round, one thing was clear. Whatever else happened tonight, Keanu had already stepped into the ring on his own terms. The real battle was about to begin. The bell's echo had barely faded when Blake came charging forward, arms swinging like pistons. His intent was obvious: to smother Keanu before he could find any rhythm. The first barrage slammed into Keanu's guard with heavy thuds, the gloves and forearms absorbing most of the impact, but still rattling his frame. Blake's confidence grew with each strike, the sneer on his face widening as he pressed forward, cutting off the ring. Keanu didn't retreat in panic. His footwork was deliberate, every step angled to keep his back from touching the ropes. He kept his chin tucked, hands high, letting Blake burn energy in the opening fury. The younger fighter was throwing with everything he had, but Keanu's tight defense blunted the blows. A hook glanced off his temple. A body shot sank into his ribs, but he rolled with it, lessening the damage. The crowd's roar surged each time Blake's fists connected, but there were murmurs in between. Subtle, curious voices noticing how Keanu remained composed under fire. He wasn't trading recklessly. He was studying. Measuring. Blake threw a looping right hand, and for the first time, Keanu answered. A short, sharp jab split the distance, snapping Blake's head back. It wasn't enough to hurt him, but it made him hesitate for a beat. Keanu stepped back into guard, eyes never leaving his opponent's. Blake snarled and came forward again, but the next exchange was different. Keanu's timing sharpened. When a left hook came high, Keanu dipped and countered with a straight to the body. When Blake tried to swarm him against the ropes, Keanu pivoted out, landing a quick, cuffing shot to the side of his head on the exit. The pace was relentless, sweat already darkening Blake's hairline, but Keanu's breathing stayed measured. Every second he survived the onslaught was a small victory. Every counter another crack in Blake's momentum. Midway through the round, Blake's wild energy began to flatten. His punches still had power, but there was a fraction more space between them. Keanu saw it. He tested with a front kick to the thigh, forcing Blake to reset his stance. Then he closed his guard again, waiting for the right opening. The crowd leaned forward, sensing the shift, even if Blake didn't yet realize it. Blake regrouped quickly, circling to his left, trying to find a fresh angle. He faked a jab and lunged with a looping right hook. Keanu's guard rose instantly, absorbing the blow, but this time he didn't just block. He fired a quick left counter that clipped Blake's cheek and forced him to step back. It wasn't a power shot, but it carried a message. Keanu wasn't just a stationary target. The crowd reacted with a surprised cheer, the sound cutting through the usual chants for Blake. Cameras flashed from ringside, freezing the moment of contact in midair. Blake's eyes narrowed, his grin tightening into something more serious. He surged forward again, this time mixing body shots with head attacks. A thudding left dug into Keanu's side, sending a flash of pain through the older fighter's ribs. He exhaled sharply, but didn't backpedal. Instead, he tied Blake up in the clinch, leaning some of his weight to slow the younger man's legs. The referee stepped in, breaking them apart. The second they were free, Blake charged again, smelling an opportunity. Keanu let him come, hands up, feet sliding smoothly over the canvas. Blake threw a three-punch combination, jab, cross, hook, but on the hook, Keanu ducked low and pivoted out, leaving Blake swinging into empty space. From the outside, it looked like a simple defensive move, but those in the crowd who knew the sport recognized it for what it was: control. Keanu was dictating where the exchanges happened, making Blake fight on his terms. Another flurry from Blake, another high guard from Keanu. But this time, Keanu fired a sharp inside leg kick that cracked against Blake's thigh. The sound echoed through the arena. Blake's face tightened, more from surprise than pain. He hadn't expected that kind of precision from a man most had written off as a slow, aging actor. The round ticked toward its final minute, and the energy in the arena shifted. The chants began to mix, some for Blake, but others now for Keanu. People could see he wasn't folding under the pressure. He was still in it, still calculating. Blake, feeling the attention split, doubled down. He threw a spinning back fist. Flashy, but risky. Keanu stepped just out of range, watching it sail by like a slow-moving door. The clock wound down. The air felt electric. The mist-spinning strike left Blake slightly off balance, and Keanu saw the opening. He didn't rush it. He stepped in with a quick jab to re-establish range, then feinted another punch, drawing Blake's guard high. That was the moment Keanu snapped a sidekick straight into Blake's midsection. It wasn't wild or telegraphed. It was measured, cleaned, and perfectly timed. Blake's torso jerked backward from the impact, and he took 2 steps to steady himself. The crowd erupted, some gasping, others cheering in disbelief. For a split second, Blake's expression betrayed him. Beneath the bravado, there was the faintest flicker of acknowledgement. This wasn't going to be the easy spectacle he'd promised the media. Keanu lowered his leg and reset his stance, breathing slow and steady, eyes locked on his opponent. He didn't follow up with reckless aggression. He let the moment speak for itself. The arena seemed to hum with a new kind of energy, one that leaned closer toward him. Blake, recovering, forced a smirk and gave a sarcastic clap, but the edge in his confidence was dented. He circled away, looking to run out the remaining seconds rather than give Keanu another chance to score. The final exchanges of the round were cautious. Blake threw a probing jab that Keanu parried with ease. Keanu answered with a light, low kick, more to remind Blake that every range was his to contest. The buzzer sounded, ending the first round. The fighters turned toward their corners. Blake strode back with his chin high, but he was breathing heavier than expected. Keanu walked calmly, a faint sheen of sweat on his brow, chest rising in a steady rhythm. As Keanu sat down on his stool, Marcus leaned in, speaking low and precise. "Perfect. You felt him. You know what he's got now. Stay patient." Keanu nodded, sipping water without taking his eyes off Blake across the ring. The younger man was getting his arms rubbed down, trainers speaking fast, urgency in their voices. Around the arena, commentators buzzed over the replay of that sidekick, frame by frame. The slow-moving footage showed every detail. The shift in Keanu's stance, the snap of his hip, the exact moment the ball of his foot sank into Blake's abdomen. It wasn't a knockout blow, but it was a message. Tomorrow might have been promised to Blake by the bookies and the headlines, but right now, in this moment, the fight felt wide open. The second round began with a noticeable shift in Blake's body language. The smirk he had worn before was replaced by a sharper, more focused stare. He bounced on his feet, snapping his jab out quickly as if to reassert control. But beneath the rhythm, there was a tension, the kind that came from knowing your opponent had already found a way to touch you cleanly. Blake came forward with more aggression, looking to force Keanu into exchanges. He feinted low, then threw a quick 1-2 combination, the second punch grazing Keanu's temple. It wasn't enough to cause damage, but the crowd roared anyway, sensing the pace was about to rise. Keanu kept his guard high, circling to his left, refusing to get drawn into a wild brawl. His breathing was steady, his eyes scanning for the smallest cues. Every time Blake tried to trap him near the ropes, Keanu angled off, using subtle footwork to escape. Frustration started to leak into Blake's movements. He began talking between punches, tossing out insults that could be heard even over the noise of the crowd. "Come on, old man," he barked, waving him in. "Show me something." Keanu didn't bite. He simply stepped forward, caught Blake's next jab on his forearm, and closed the distance into a tight clinch. From there, the tone of the fight changed. Blake had expected to dominate the close range with brute strength, but Keanu's years of training in judo and jiu-jitsu came alive. With a subtle shift of his hips and a pull on Blake's arm, Keanu unbalanced him and sent him stumbling sideways with a clean foot sweep. The crowd gasped. Blake scrambled to his feet, embarrassed but unhurt, and charged back in. Again, Keanu clinched, turned him, and landed a short knee to the body before breaking away. Commentators leaned into their microphones, voices rising with surprise. "This is smart fighting," one said. "He's making Blake carry his weight, making him work in positions he's not comfortable in. That's how you drain a power puncher." Blake's eyes flashed with irritation. He threw a hard right hand that whistled past Keanu's ear, but Keanu answered with a crisp jab of his own, snapping Blake's head back. It was clear now. Keanu wasn't trying to outmuscle his opponent. He was dismantling him piece by piece, and the patience in his approach was starting to show its effect. Blake shook his head as if trying to clear away the sting of that last jab. He wiped his mouth with the back of his glove and stepped forward again, a touch more recklessly now. The taunts kept coming, his voice edged with frustration. "That all you got, Reeves? You're in here to survive, not to win." Keanu didn't reply. His silence seemed to irritate Blake more than any counterpunch could. The older man kept moving just outside the arc of Blake's heavier strikes, forcing him to chase. Each time Blake lunged, Keanu either slipped under the punch or pivoted away, making Blake reset over and over again. The crowd began to pick up on the pattern. What had once looked like Blake controlling the pace was now turning into Keanu quietly dictating it. Every clinch, every deflection of a punch, every sidestep was sapping Blake's energy. When Blake tried to crowd him into a corner, Keanu dipped under a looping hook and wrapped his arms around Blake's torso in a body lock. With a quick turn of his hips, he executed a textbook judo throw, sending Blake down onto the canvas with a heavy thud. The referee stepped in to reset them, and the arena erupted with cheers. Back on their feet, Blake's breathing was noticeably heavier. Keanu, meanwhile, still looked composed, though a bead of sweat ran down the side of his face. He gave a small nod to Marcus in his corner, the kind that said everything was going according to plan. Blake, unwilling to be shown up again, came charging forward with a left hook, right cross, then another hook aimed high. Keanu blocked the first, rolled under the second, and pivoted on the third, letting it sail harmlessly past his head. The commentators were animated now. "He's reading him like a book," one said. "Look at the way Keanu's setting traps. This is veteran fight IQ on display." Blake snarled and shoved Keanu's guard down, looking for a clean shot to the chin. But Keanu kept his focus, eyes locked on Blake's shoulders, not his hands. Every twitch, every shift of weight told him what was coming next. It was a game of patience, and Keanu was winning it without even needing to land big shots, at least not yet. The seconds ticked away in the round, the sound of the crowd blending into a constant wall of noise. Blake circled to his left, trying to cut Keanu off, then stepped in hard with a lunging jab meant to set up his power shot. Keanu leaned just enough to avoid the jab, feeling the wind from the punch brush past his cheek. Blake's weight shifted forward onto his lead foot, his right shoulder drawing back, the telltale sign of the knockout hook he had been waiting to land all night. Marcus, from the corner, shouted a warning, but Keanu didn't need it. He'd seen this in sparring and tape study, in his mind 100 times over. Instead of retreating, he stepped slightly inside the arc of the punch. The hook swept wide, missing his head by inches, and Keanu's body turned with the momentum, his left foot pivoting as his right arm whipped around in a clean, fluid motion. His glove connected flush with Blake's jaw in a spinning back fist so precise it made the air crack. The crowd's roar hit like an earthquake. The commentators shouted over each other, one of them nearly out of his seat. Blake stumbled back, his eyes momentarily glassy, stunned not just by the impact, but by the fact that Keanu had set the trap so perfectly. Keanu didn't rush in for the finish. He stepped forward just enough to keep the pressure, his stance balanced, his breathing steady. This wasn't about a reckless flurry. It was about showing Blake, the fans, and himself that he belonged in there. The round closed with Blake backing away, shaking his head in disbelief as the bell rang. Keanu walked calmly to his corner, the crowd still buzzing. He didn't celebrate. He didn't gesture to the audience. He simply sat on his stool, took a sip of water, and listened to Marcus's low, steady voice. "Exactly like we planned," Marcus said. "One round at a time." He's starting to crack. Keanu nodded once. Across the ring, Blake slammed himself down onto his own stool, his team fanning him furiously. For the first time all fight, the swagger in his eyes had dimmed. The tide was turning. The bell for round 3 echoed through the arena, and Blake burst forward like a bull finally let loose. His mouthguard flashed as he yelled something unintelligible, fists swinging with wild urgency. The measured patience of earlier rounds was gone, replaced by raw aggression. Keanu stayed light on his feet, feeling the canvas under each step. His eyes locked on Blake's chest rather than his flailing hands. He had learned long ago that the chest told the truth. It didn't faint the way the head and shoulders could. Blake lunged with a looping overhand right, missing by inches as Keanu pivoted away. The crowd gasped at the near miss, but Keanu didn't counter immediately. Instead, he let Blake's own momentum carry him forward, subtly stepping into the space just behind Blake's planted foot. In one smooth motion, Keanu hooked his lead leg behind Blake's and gave the lightest of shoves to his shoulder. The effect was instant. Blake's balance went from unstable to non-existent, and his body hit the mat with a loud thud that reverberated in the silence before the crowd erupted. Keanu didn't pounce recklessly. He followed the takedown into a controlling position, sliding his knee across Blake's thigh to pin one leg while his hands worked to secure wrist control. Blake thrashed beneath him, trying to buck free, but every movement seemed to tighten Keanu's grip. From the stands, commentators pointed out Keanu's composure, the way he made small adjustments instead of forcing anything. Blake's face twisted in frustration, his breathing already heavy from the frantic opening minute. Keanu pressed down with his shoulder, forcing Blake to carry his weight. It was a slow grind, a battle not just of skill, but of willpower. Every second Blake spent on his back was another point for Keanu, and another drain on the champion's reserves. Blake snarled and tried to roll out, but Keanu shifted seamlessly, keeping him pinned until the referee leaned in to check the action. The champion's arrogance was giving way to something new, the first true signs of desperation. Blake's frustration boiled over. He shoved against Keanu's chest, trying to create space, but Keanu anticipated it. Instead of resisting head-on, he let the push open a window, sliding his knee free and circling smoothly back to his feet. The crowd roared at the sight of the 59-year-old actor standing over the reigning champion with calm, unshaken control. Blake scrambled up quickly, his jaw tight, cheeks flushed from both exertion and embarrassment. His earlier confidence was replaced by darting eyes, searching for an opening that wasn't there. Keanu kept his stance compact, hands high, feet moving just enough to stay in range without being a target. Blake swung with a desperate left hook. Keanu blocked it effortlessly and answered with a short, snapping jab to the nose. Not meant to knock him out, but to remind him that the distance belonged to Keanu now. Blake shook his head, more in frustration than pain, and charged again. This time, Keanu didn't retreat. He met Blake's forward rush by sidestepping and hooking a leg behind his opponent's ankle. The same trip that had worked earlier. It wasn't flashy, but it was effective. Blake stumbled, barely keeping his footing, and the crowd erupted again. The commentators noted how Blake's face was changing, no longer that of a man playing to the cameras, but of a fighter realizing his plan was slipping away. Keanu, on the other hand, looked almost serene. Every movement was deliberate, measured, and void of wasted energy. The seconds ticked away in the round. Keanu closed the distance once more, tying Blake up in a clinch near the ropes. Blake tried to muscle his way free, but Keanu dug in a shoulder and shifted his weight, forcing him back into the corner. Short knees to the thigh followed. Not devastating, but enough to sap energy and morale. By the time the referee broke them apart, Blake's breathing was loud enough to be heard over the first few rows. Keanu backed up, ready for whatever was coming next, knowing there were still moments left to control before the bell. Blake tried one last flurry before the round's end, throwing a wild right cross that sailed past Keanu's head. The miss left him off balance, and Keanu punished the mistake with a quick sidestep and a shove to send him stumbling into the ropes. The crowd roared at the clean execution, a sound that seemed to cut deeper into Blake's pride than any punch could. Blake pushed himself off the ropes and squared up again, but his chest was heaving. Sweat rolled down his face, stinging his eyes, and his arms hung heavier than before. The aura of invincibility he'd carried into the arena was cracking under the weight of Keanu's discipline. Keanu stayed patient, keeping his guard tight and footwork crisp. He wasn't looking for a knockout here. He was looking to wear Blake down, to make him understand that the man he mocked as a grandpa could still dictate the pace of a fight against the very best. With less than 20 seconds left in the round, Keanu feinted a jab and slipped inside, locking Blake in another clinch. Blake grunted in frustration, trying to wrench free, but Keanu used his positioning to land two short, precise shots to the body. Nothing flashy, just enough to make Blake feel them the next time he took a deep breath. The referee separated them with only a few seconds left. Keanu backed off, eyes never leaving his opponent, posture straight, breathing steady. Blake, on the other hand, looked both angry and weary, like a man starting to realize the fight wasn't going to be the easy spectacle he promised his fans. The bell rang and the round was over. Keanu walked calmly to his corner, not even glancing at the crowd. Blake lingered in the center for a second longer, chest rising and falling sharply, before finally heading to his stool. As the commentators summed up the round, their tone had shifted. The arrogance was gone from their analysis. Now they spoke about Keanu's control, his composure, and how the fight was turning from a publicity stunt into a genuine contest, one where the underdog was beginning to look like the man in charge. The final round began with the crowd on its feet, the noise crashing down like a tidal wave. Blake came out fast, but the fire in his movements had dulled. His punches were still heavy, but they lacked the snap they once had. Keanu met him in the center, eyes locked, breathing calm and controlled. Blake threw a looping left hook, but Keanu slipped under it with ease, answering with a sharp inside leg kick that thudded against Blake's thigh. Blake tried to respond with a quick jab, but Keanu caught it on his forearm and countered with a crisp 1-2 combination that landed flush on the head and chest. The commentators were nearly shouting over the crowd, pointing out how Keanu's timing had become razor sharp. Each strike was deliberate, every step calculated. He wasn't chasing a knockout, he was dismantling Blake piece by piece, proving dominance without crossing into recklessness. Blake's breathing was ragged now. Sweat dripped into his eyes, and every exhale sounded like it carried weight. He lunged forward in frustration, but Keanu pivoted away, turning his opponent's aggression into an opening. A quick push kick to the midsection sent Blake staggering back a few steps. The crowd roared again, sensing the shift. Keanu pressed forward with precision, launching a jab to measure distance, then snapping a right cross straight through Blake's guard. Blake stumbled, quickly raising his hands to protect his head. Keanu didn't chase recklessly. He stayed measured, circling, waiting for the right angle. Then he attacked the legs again, forcing Blake to shift his stance and lose balance. Every movement was a reminder that Keanu was in control of the fight's rhythm now. Blake swung wildly once more, hoping for a miracle punch, but Keanu was gone before it could land. In its place, Keanu delivered another clean body shot, the kind that drained energy faster than any blow to the head. The round was halfway done, and Blake looked like a man running out of options. Keanu, on the other hand, still had more to show. Blake circled to his right, trying to create space, but Keanu shadowed his every step. The crowd's cheers rose and fell with each exchange, sensing that this was more than a fight. It was a battle of willpower and discipline. Keanu feinted with his shoulder, making Blake flinch. That hesitation was all he needed. He snapped a front kick into Blake's midsection, folding him slightly. Without rushing, Keanu followed with a short left hook that grazed the jaw, then retreated just enough to avoid the desperate counter that came in return. Blake's frustration boiled over. He taunted, motioning for Keanu to come on, but his voice lacked the confidence it had in earlier rounds. The swagger that had filled press conferences and interviews was gone, replaced by the weight of a fight that was slipping through his fingers. Keanu moved forward with steady pressure. A jab landed, then another. Each one pushed Blake backward toward the fence. The commentators noted how Keanu wasn't just striking, he was controlling space, dictating every movement. Blake's shoulders hit the cage, and he had nowhere left to retreat. The crowd sensed the climax building. Keanu unleashed a quick flurry, jab, cross, hook, leg kick, every shot landing with surgical accuracy. Blake tried to swing back, but Keanu ducked under and clinched, pinning him briefly before disengaging and letting him breathe for a second. It was a subtle act of control, a reminder that Keanu was choosing when and how the exchanges happened. In the final minute, Keanu threw a high kick that glanced off Blake's guard. It didn't land cleanly, but it forced him to stagger sideways. The crowd gasped at the sudden burst of speed. Keanu stayed calm. No wild chase, just another step closer to finishing this fight exactly how he wanted. Blake's chest was heaving now. His arms hung lower between combinations. Every step forward looked like an effort. Keanu, in contrast, stood tall, shoulders relaxed, eyes still sharp, as if the fight had just begun. The seconds were ticking down. It was clear the end was near, but Keanu had one last statement to make before the final bell. With less than 30 seconds on the clock, Keanu stepped in and delivered a crisp body jab that made Blake wince. He followed with a quick leg sweep, catching Blake off balance and sending him to the canvas with a thud that echoed through the arena. The crowd erupted, expecting Keanu to pounce and finish the fight with ground and pound. But instead of rushing in with fists, he stepped back. His breathing was steady, his eyes never leaving Blake's. He extended his hand. For a moment, Blake just stared, still catching his breath, pride warring with fatigue. The offer was genuine, no mockery, no gloating, just respect. Slowly, Blake reached up and took Keanu's hand, allowing himself to be pulled to his feet. The two men stood face to face again. This time there was no shove, no insult, no bravado, just two fighters who had given everything they had. The bell rang, and the arena filled with a roar that seemed to shake the walls. Keanu's corner rushed in, patting his back and embracing him. Across the cage, Blake slumped onto his stool, sweat dripping from his hair, his chest still heaving. The ring announcer stepped forward, microphone in hand. The judges' scorecards were collected and read aloud. Unanimous decision, every judge had awarded Keanu the win. The cheers rose again, louder this time, not just for the victory, but for the way it was earned. No cheap shots, no showboating, no disrespect. Keanu had faced the taunts, the insults, the personal attacks, and answered with discipline, skill, and grace. Blake, still breathing heavily, walked to the center. He offered a brief nod before raising Keanu's hand himself, acknowledging defeat with a humility that had been absent throughout the buildup. Flashbulbs from photographers lit the cage in bursts as fans captured the image of a champion humbled and a veteran standing tall. Keanu's victory wasn't just about scorecards or statistics. It was about proving that dignity could be more powerful than arrogance, and that the quiet resolve of a man determined to do things his way could silence the loudest of doubters. The fight was over, but the story was only beginning. The cage door swung open and Keanu stepped out into the blinding lights. The cheers were still thunderous, but there was a different energy now. Less frenzy, more reverence. He walked to the center of the octagon where a reporter waited with a microphone. Sweat still glistened on his brow, but his breathing was steady, his presence calm. "Keanu," the reporter began, "the world just watched you beat the reigning UFC champion. After all the trash talk, after all the doubts, what does this victory mean to you?" Keanu adjusted the mic slightly and spoke in a voice that carried across the silent arena. "Martial arts isn't about hurting people," he said. "It's about respect. It's about discipline. It's about learning to control yourself when you have every reason not to." The crowd erupted again, but Keanu didn't raise his fists or bask in the noise. He simply nodded once and handed the microphone back, letting the words hang in the air. Meanwhile, Blake was still in the cage, speaking to another interviewer. His tone was different now, quieter, measured. "I underestimated him," Blake admitted. "I thought he was just some old movie star trying to get attention. But he fought smart, he fought hard, and he fought clean. That's what a real martial artist is. I owe him an apology, and I mean that." The clip of that moment went viral almost instantly. Social media feeds filled with side-by-side images of Blake's pre-fight arrogance and his humbled post-fight expression. Fans who once cheered his insults were now praising his admission, but the praise for Keanu was even louder. Later that night, after the adrenaline of the win had faded, Keanu slipped away from the after-party invites and sponsored dinners. Instead, he walked into a quiet children's hospital ward. In his hands was a folded check. The entire charity portion of his fight purse, made out to the hospital's oncology department. The nurses led him to a room where a group of children were gathered. One of them, a teenage boy with thin hair and bright eyes, looked up in surprise. This was the boy who had once idolized Blake, the boy who had told everyone in the ward that Blake would crush Keanu. The boy hesitated for a moment, glancing at the donation check in Keanu's hand, then back at his face. Slowly, a smile began to spread. "You're my hero, Keanu," he said, his voice a mix of awe and sincerity. Keanu knelt down beside the bed so they were at eye level. "No," he replied gently, "you're the hero. You're the one fighting every single day. I just had a match. You're fighting a war." The boy's eyes welled up, and for a moment the room felt completely still. The beeping of the machines faded into the background as Keanu reached into his bag and pulled out a pair of signed gloves, the very ones he'd worn during the fight. He handed them to the boy, who held them like they were made of glass. "I wore these tonight," Keanu said softly. "I want you to have them. Every time you look at them, I hope you remember that strength doesn't always mean throwing the hardest punch. Sometimes it means standing your ground, even when everyone tells you that you can't." The boy nodded, clutching the gloves to his chest. Around the room, parents and nurses watched silently, some wiping away tears. Keanu stayed in the ward for over an hour, talking to the children, listening to their stories, laughing with them when they made jokes about his movies, and even letting one little girl try on his championship belt for a photo. He signed posters, left notes for those who were asleep, and promised he would come back. Before he left, the head nurse approached him with gratitude in her eyes. "We see celebrities come and go," she told him, "but you made them feel like they mattered. That's worth more than any check." Keanu didn't have a grand response. He just smiled faintly, gave a small bow, and slipped out into the cool night air. The fight might have been over, but the impact of that night was still growing, not in the roar of arenas, but in quiet hospital rooms where hope was sometimes hard to find. Outside the hospital, the street was calm. No paparazzi, no flashing cameras, just the distant hum of the city. Keanu paused under a street lamp, letting the events of the day settle in his mind. The fight had been a spectacle, but this was the real victory. As he walked toward his car, his phone buzzed. It was a notification from a news outlet. They had posted a clip of his post-fight interview alongside footage of him at the children's ward. The headline read, "Keanu Reeves wins more than a fight." The comment section was overflowing with messages of respect from fans and even former critics. One stood out. It was from Blake himself. He'd posted a public statement that read, "I came into this thinking I'd humiliate him. Instead, I learned what real strength looks like. I'm sorry for what I said, and I'm grateful he taught me a lesson I'll never forget." Keanu read it quietly, then slipped his phone back into his pocket. The apology wasn't about winning or losing. It was about growth, the kind that couldn't be measured on a scoreboard. The next morning, headlines around the world weren't just about the fight. They were about humility, respect, and kindness. Photos of Keanu kneeling beside the young boy's bed became the image of the week, shared across social media with captions like, "Stay humble, stay kind," and "The real champion." Back at his home later that day, Keanu placed his championship belt on a shelf right next to a framed photo of his parents. He glanced at it for a long moment, remembering everything they had taught him. That strength without compassion is just aggression, and that winning without honor isn't winning at all. He whispered the words again, almost to himself. "Stay humble, stay kind." The screen fades to black.